If there's any superhero who's been a popular one to adapt for the big screen, it is certainly The Dark Knight. Since Tim Burton made the big budgeted, darker take on the Bat in 1989, we've rarely had that much of a gap between cinematic outings for Batman, with one big exception. The 8-year period after Batman and Robin and before Batman Begins. I mean, they only left 4 years between the end of the Nolan trilogy before putting him in the DCU. So why was there such a big gap? Even at the worst of times, Batman as a franchise couldn't make enough money to make Bruce Wayne blush. Well, what if there wasn't meant to be a big gap? What if there had been a lot of projects that fell by the wayside? And what if the man who killed the Batman franchise to so many people with Batman and Robin had come back, as was intended, to make another film? This is the story of Joel Schumacher's third Batman film.
This is how the Batman died.
So, with the death of Joel Schumacher, and I mean, let's be honest, Batman is pretty much always relevant, I figured now is as good a time as any to look at what this film was, what it could have been. This is an odd one because normally when you look at projects from developmental hell, people talk very, very openly about it, and there's a lot of detail about its development. But with Batman Triumphant, we only have rumor, generally speaking, because people haven't spoken that much about it, and there's not a lot to go on. And I say triumphant in quotation marks because the truth is that's not the name of the movie, but everyone thinks it is because of the pervasive online rumors about it. People called it Batman Triumphant, and it kind of stuck. But according to the writer of the film, Mark Protasevich, it was never meant to be Batman Triumphant. In fact, the film would have been called Batman Unchained. Now let's just dig into that for a second. Joel Schumacher is a name that a lot of people have associated with Batman. In fact, when he died, Batman trended on Twitter. But the truth is, that's a disservice to him as a director. He has quite a wide array of films in his filmography. St. Elmo's Fire, The Lost Boys, Flatliners, Phone Booth, and Falling Down. To be honest, he isn't just a Batman guy. He's an accomplished director that, based on the films I just named, can do darker, more serious material than,
Batman and Robin.
I also don't especially hate Schumacher's Batman. One of the reasons I think the character has, survived for so long is because you can interpret Batman in so many different ways. I think there's room for the light campiness of an Adam West Batman alongside a darker Ben Affleck version of Batman, for example. The character can work in many different ways effectively. But there's also a few things you should know about the direction that Batman went post Burton's film Batman Returns. Firstly, we should mention that Warner Bros. Weren't really impressed or pleased with Batman Returns. Even though it was clearly demand for the film, in fact, its opening weekend was bigger than the behemoth that Burton had delivered with the first 1989 Batman film. Overall, the film only managed to do 2/3 of the box office of the film that preceded it. It was also dark enough to the point that McDonald's cut short their Happy Meal promotion for the film, which is almost unheard of because they feared backlash from parents who said that they were promoting a film to kids who should not see such a dark film. I shouldn't have to tell you this stuff. I hope I don't have to. But franchises, especially back in the day, had to be able to be marketable, do promotional tie-ins, toys, and kids kind of had to see it. In fact, one of the reasons Return of the Jedi went a bit of a softer direction than was initially intended was because of toys, but I digress. That's something we might talk about another day. The point is that at the time, Warner Bros. Wanted a lighter and more family-friendly tone, which certainly explained the pivot towards Batman Forever. They didn't especially want another Burton-esque film. They wanted something more child-friendly with merchandising potential, which is exactly what Batman Forever was. In fact, Burton actually tells a story of going to Warner Bros. And saying, hey, this is my idea for a third film. This is what I'm thinking of doing. And being met with pretty much ambivalence.
I'm going, you could do this, we could do that. And they go like, Tim, don't you want to do like a smaller movie now? Just something that's more, and like about, half hour into the meeting, I go, you don't want me to make another one, do you?
So he assisted and helped them pick Joel Schumacher to replace him. And while Schumacher certainly opted for a more stylized version of the world, he had in fact always toyed with the idea of the films being a little bit darker. At one point, he hoped to adapt Frank Miller's Batman Year One, a darker, more grounded origin that helped inform Batman Begins. Forever was in fact a much darker in tone than what we got as well. Numerous deleted scenes have attested to that. There was a scene with Two-Face painting "Bat must die" in blood on the walls of Arkham. Bruce battling with guilt over the night his parents died. It certainly pointed to it being a darker film. And since Schumacher's death, there's been renewed talk of a director's cut of Batman Forever that was darker than what we got in the end. The point being that Schumacher is no stranger to darker work and may have even envisioned at first to bring a darker version to the screen. And despite people's misgivings, Batman Forever was a huge success. Domestically, it was the biggest film of 1995, and that surprises a lot of people now, but it was a big surprise even then. Nobody expected this film to be as big as it was. It was such a success that Warner Brothers actually ditched the 3-year gap between the last few Batman films and instead wanted 2 years between Batman Forever and the next Batman film, which meant that Joel Schumacher went straight from Batman Forever to his next film, A Time to Kill, and then went to Batman and Robin year after year after year. Any uneasiness that toy companies may have had after Batman Returns had totally dissipated. Warner Bros. Apparently made as much as $125 million just from tie-ins, merchandise, and toys from the next film, Batman and Robin. And if you talk to Joel Schumacher, he basically said that toy companies wanted nothing to do with them really for Batman Forever. They were kind of not too sure of what they would get because they'd been burned by Batman Returns. But Batman and Robin, everyone was knocking at the door hoping to be a part of it. I say all this about Batman and Robin because I want to clarify that essentially the film was rushed and it was a victim of a lot of insistence on being toyetic and that you could market it and make toys out of it. It was also in an interesting position that is common for films today, but wasn't so much so back in 1997, in that this was a franchise with broad public appeal, to most of the 4 quadrants: young men, young women, older women. Also, it was at a time when the internet was making the speculation and reporting of rumors and leaks more accessible and available than before. I mean, nowadays it's common that all films kind of get this scrutiny, but back then this was one of the few big franchises based on an established IP, leading to more intense scrutiny. And that's not to excuse Batman and Robin, but just to say that it was always under pressure to perform well, and it did so under scrutiny from fans, corporate greed, and a very tight schedule. As much as I actually don't mind the film, when you view it as a campy extension of Adam West's Batman from the 60s, I think it's okay and a bit more enjoyable. There's no other way to put it though. Batman and Robin bit them on the ass, like hard, right on the badass. All that being said, before the film was released, and even for some time after, there was excitement in the Batman property. They thought the film was going to do well. So much so that after seeing the dailies, they actually wanted Schumacher to start work on a sequel to Batman and Robin, preliminary set for 1999. This was to be Batman Unchained. The reason I want to establish all this was for a few reasons. Number one, generally speaking, Joel Schumacher doesn't direct kids' fare. In fact, generally speaking, he does smaller films. And number two, there was indications he wanted a darker film from the get-go. And finally, Warner Bros. Clearly wanted a different direction for the next film, given the critical failure of Batman and Robin. I felt that should be established, as some people kind of try to suggest that Schumacher's retroactively claiming he would have made Batman Begins, but that's not really in the spirit of what he said. In fact, as far back as 1998, he told Variety, "I felt I disappointed a lot of older fans by being too conscious of the family aspect. I'd gotten tens of thousands of letters from parents asking a film that their children can go to. Now I owe the hardcore fans the Batman movie they would love me to give them." In essence, the Batman franchise sort of swung from dark to child-friendly and was preparing to swing back to dark once again. George Clooney was actually still had a contract, and he expressed interest in returning to see what he could have done better. And by mid-98, Schumacher told E! Online that he discussed with producers him doing another Batman film that was smaller in scale, had less villains, and was more true to the comic books. Naturally, as he had indicated before, he gravitated to looking at Year One for inspiration. Around this time though, Warner Bros. Really didn't seem sure what to do with The Dark Knight though. Seemingly having failed with the lighter tone and alienated people with the darker tone, they were left not entirely sure how to proceed with Batman. In fact, as many as 5 Batman projects were developed and cancelled before Batman Begins, none of which saw the light of day. In fact, their cold feet and concern after the box office of Batman and Robin even led to them cancelling Superman Lives with Nicolas Cage as Superman. What exactly would this film have been, though? This Batman Unchained or Batman Triumphant? Schumacher intended this to be his last Batman film, and likely would have been a point where the character took a break for a while to avoid people getting burnt out on the bat. With that in mind, a new writer was hired in Mark Protosevich, and it's through Mark that we get a good indication of what this film would have been. He said it was indeed going to be a darker take on Batman, that he intended to do a psychological dive into the character and why Bruce Wayne wants to dress as a bat and fight crime. On Schumacher's part, he said he wanted the film to have a much lower budget, presumably because he wanted it to have a better chance of being made, because he teased that he expected Warner Bros. To kick him out of the building after he pitched it, which, yeah, that's probably a bit hyperbolic, but did you expect subtlety from the guy who put nipples on the batsuit? Come on. So let's start with the story first, because the film apparently would have had Batman confronting his past and conquering his fears. The other problem is that Batman and Robin have a falling out throughout the course of the film, and as a result, we don't see Robin till towards the end of the film, and it leads to Bruce being incredibly tormented. To make matters much worse for Batman, he has to battle two villains this time around, Scarecrow and Harley Quinn. And interestingly enough, each villain has a different problem with each persona. Scarecrow has a problem with Bruce Wayne, while Harley Quinn has a problem with Batman. Now, you might be thinking, what's going on with Harley Quinn here? Because she's the Joker's sidekick, and the Joker's dead, and Harley wasn't there, so how is this going to work? Well, the thing is, the biggest difference this makes to the source material is that in this iteration, Harley Quinn is not the Joker's sidekick, he is the Joker's daughter. So a big part of Batman confronting his past was actually fighting Harley Quinn, who wants revenge for her father. Throughout the course of the film, Scarecrow manages to find out that Bruce was Batman, leading to him eventually teaming up with Harley to drive him insane and send him to Arkham Asylum. Scarecrow, as you would expect, hopes to accomplish this with the use of fear toxin, leading to one of the most talked about scenes from the film, where in the final act, while dosed with fear toxin, Batman hallucinates in a scene that would have tied together all the previous Batman entries up till now. In a hallucinatory state, he sees Riddler, Two-Face, Catwoman, Penguin, and most notably, the Joker. And not only that, but they hope to get the actors back who portrayed them: Tommy Lee Jones, Jim Carrey, Michelle Pfeiffer, Danny DeVito, and of course, Jack Nicholson. When all hope appears lost, Robin returns. Some have suggested he actually returns as Nightwing. That's never been confirmed. And they defeat the baddies once and for all. Our film ends with Batman in a cave in Bali, surrounded by bats, having now conquered his fear. Cut to black. So that's the general story of Batman Unchained. The finer points of the film and the script generally escape us though, but seemingly Batgirl was not in the script, so the film would mostly have been Batman going it alone. And we also heard a rumor that there was going to be a courtroom scene where Batman is confronted by his rogues gallery from the past films, which is a bit odd because they're in the last act as well. So are you going to ruin the reveal and have him in the middle of the film, or are you just going to have him after he's already defeated him? It doesn't make much sense, but it could have been the script, but I doubt it would ever actually have made it to the film had it been made. Another problem is that only one draft of the script was ever actually written. Mark Protosevich was hired to write this in 1996, and by 1997, Batman and Robin had come out and been a disappointment. By his own admission, he only finished the script when Batman and Robin opened, which means it was unlikely that this would ever have come to fruition after the disastrous reception of Batman and Robin. The other thing is that the script never leaked online, as is quite rare for films in development hell. There is a rumored script online, but it doesn't line up with any of the plot details, and honestly, it's so amateurishly written that either it would have been a dreadful film, or more likely, in my opinion, it's a fake, elaborate script. That being said, it seemed like there was a sort of miscommunication in general, because Joel Schumacher had intentions of making this a very small, low-budget film, but the feedback that Protosevich got from Warner Bros. Was that the script he had turned in would be the most expensive film of all time, likely due to paying for all those actors to return. Jack Nicholson does not come cheap. In a time when the returns on Batman were a low point, it didn't seem wise to double down on the cast and director of the previous film, while also splashing out on bringing actors back for not a lot of screen time, especially considering that the franchise had kind of lost a lot of the goodwill it had built up in previous entries, especially after Batman and Robin. Other aspects we do know, though, are casting, some rumoured and some seemingly confirmed. For the role of Scarecrow, rumours range from the likes of Jeff Goldblum, Steve Buscemi to Christopher Lloyd and most unusually Howard Stern. One of the closest confirmations we have is apparently that Joel Schumacher went to the set of Face Off and offered the role to Nicolas Cage, which is close we've got to confirmation in the casting, but it also seems a bit contradictory because he would have been in line to play Superman for Warner Bros. Ill-fated Superman Lives. Coolio insists that he was going to be playing the Scarecrow, and that was the reason for him randomly popping up in Batman and Robin, was to set up for him appearing as the villain in the sequel, which seems odd considering he was overseeing a street race in that film. So it's kind of hard to understand why Jonathan Crane would be looking at street races, but there you go. The role of Harley Quinn, though, had some high-profile names attached, including Madonna and Courtney Love. While writer Mark Rodasevich admits he did meet with Love, he says the role never came up. But he said he had a lovely lunch, one of his better ones in Hollywood, which is nice. Which doesn't make things any clearer for this proposed Batman entry. The rumours of casting don't stop there, though, and some suggesting that Batman himself would actually have been recast, with Joel Schumacher offering the role to Kurt Russell, much to the annoyance of producers who saw him as too old. And I spoke before about how this film faced a new scrutiny from the internet, which was rare at the time, and in keeping with that, rumours were so out of control to the point that the prominent rumour website Dark Horizons actually put a moratorium on Batman Triumphant rumours, which is unheard of now. This, coupled with the relative silence from those involved, the abundance of Batman projects in development at the time, and indeed the brief window it was developed for, have only added to the confusion surrounding Schumacher's third Batman to this day. What does seem conclusive is that the film wanted to be a back-to-basics approach after the overblown previous entries, and they hoped that it would be darker and more psychological, and the budget was hoping to be smaller, but in trying to tie a bow on this era Batman films, the budget soared. It was a film very much at odds with itself, like the director of the lightest, campiest Batman film is now going to give you the darkest and most psychological take yet. It's somehow standalone and something new, but also here's all the characters from the previous Batman films to tie together this sort of era of Batman. It was going to be a low budget, stripped down version of the movie, but it's also going to be the most expensive film of all time. Harvey Dent's personality is less split than the intentions of this film, and that no doubt was one of the factors that led to Warner Bros. Never really pursuing it, but it was far from the only one. It's June 29th, 1997. Batman and Robin's second weekend has just come to an end, with an almost unprecedented drop for the time between the weekends of 63%. The Bat franchise as we know it is dead. The film is ravaged by critics and audiences alike, and over Warner Brothers, a Mexican standoff of finger pointing and blame throwing commences about who birthed Batman and Robin. Joel Schumacher issues an apology for his work.
If I disappointed them in any way, then I really want to apologize, because it wasn't my intention. My intention was just to entertain them.
George Clooney apparently to this day offers refunds to people who can prove they've seen the film, and in his office still he has a photo of himself in costume to remind himself not to pursue big budget films. The film sort of ascends to a legendary height for killing a once lucrative franchise, and to this day is a go-to when describing a massive studio blunder that can kill a lucrative franchise. And with all that said, it's not really surprised that Batman Unchained was never pursued, as soon as you put from the director of Batman and Robin on a Batman film, it might as well be a kiss of death. It's understandable rarity that a film that flops gets a sequel, and even if it does, there's generally a massive creative overhaul, and especially in the stakes are as high as Batman. The thing is, Batman Unchained, or Batman Triumphant, whatever you choose to call it, only had one draft ever written, and that was done in anticipation of Batman and Robin succeeding. And sequels being developed in anticipation of success is fairly common. It shows confidence in that property, gets some buzz going, and it's generally a pretty cheap investment. And for a bulletproof franchise, it means you can strike while the iron is hot for the next movie. Batman should have been a bulletproof franchise, and when it wasn't, they pumped the brakes on everything. As mentioned, even Superman wasn't safe from the fallout of Batman and Robin. The truth is, when you kill the momentum of a franchise like this, it can often be pretty hard to restart. The bigger problem with Batman was that Warner Bros. Did not know how to proceed, as evidenced by the multitude of Batman projects they developed and scrapped in the years that followed. Considering that making Batman dark had led them to Schumacher in the first place, they were understandably gun-shy of going the dark route again. Certainly with Schumacher at the helm anyway. And while in theory this Batman would have worked on paper, it just didn't make much sense. Bringing in a director who just recently failed with the property and a writer in Protosevich who was unproven to wrap up a film series that had already lacked any real tonal cohesion or connection to begin with just didn't make any sense. In the shadow of the Bat, many of the people involved had very different career trajectories. Despite working on some notable projects, Mark Protosevich is probably best known for working on the films that never actually got made. It's aside from Batman included his version of Jurassic Park 4, which never came to fruition. Meanwhile, Joel Schumacher was forever branded as the man who ruined Batman, but despite this, got consistent work on admittedly smaller scale films that varied in critical and commercial success. He honestly felt like a man who was happier with a smaller scale film, and certainly he remained true to that up until his recent passing. Meanwhile, over at Warner Bros. And the Batman series, in 2005 they would successfully reboot the film series with Batman Begins, which was a darker and more psychological take on the character that was felt very much informed by Frank Miller's Year One and featured Scarecrow as a villain. And it's hard to wonder if, even unconsciously, there may have been some influence of the Unmade Schumacher film. Others have pointed to the Arkham video game series as having elements from the Protosevich scripts, and if nothing else, it's fun to speculate on what might have happened had we gotten a film like Batman Begins years earlier and how that would have informed the franchise and the Batman character as a whole. Unfortunately, in a project that's shrouded in such secrecy, that's really all we have. Speculation of what could have been. But it's hard not to wonder, had Batman been Unchained, could Batman truly have been triumphant?